The City Council of Vienna approved a ration ledger before approving a battle plan, then water, then powder. In 1529, the record shows exactly how many days the city could survive once the gates were closed. That number shaped every decision that followed. Outside the walls, the Ottoman army did not rush. It assembled. Tents were placed by rank and function. Artillery was positioned with measured spacing. Roads were secured backward toward supply depots. This was not a charge toward Vienna. It was a slow administrative movement, designed to make the city irrelevant before it fell. Inside, fear did not come from noise. It came from counting. Every cannon shot fired from the walls reduced a stockpile that could not be replaced. Every civilian fed shortened the timeline. The defenders were not thinking about victory. They were calculating endurance. Ottoman engineers began digging almost immediately. Not randomly, but methodically. Tunnels were aimed at specific bastions, whose foundations were mapped in advance. Underground war followed its own logic. Silence, measurement, temptables. A successful mine did not kill defenders directly. It removed a section of wall, converting stone into an administrative failure. Vienna responded in kind. Countermines were dug with equal precision. Listening posts were established. Men lay on the ground to feel vibrations through soil. When a tunnel was found, the response was procedural. Flood it. Collapse it. Seal it. No speeches. The siege was not about assault. It was about pressure applied over time, calibrated to exhaust systems, rather than smash them. Vienna survived in 1529 because the Ottoman system reached its logistical limit first, not because the walls were unbreakable, but because time, weather, and supply mathematics ended the operation. This pattern would repeat in 1683. Different armies. Same logic. Vienna was not defended by heroism. It was defended by accounting. Vienna mattered because it sat where several systems overlapped. Trade routes from the Danube basin passed through it. Imperial authority from the Holy Roman Empire was administered there. For the Ottomans, the city was not a symbolic prize. It was a control node. If Vienna fell, the structure behind it would not collapse immediately, but it would lose coordination. By the early 16th century, the Ottoman state had solved a problem that most European powers had not. It could move large armies over long distances while keeping them fed, paid, and regulated. This was not accidental. It was the result of standardized taxation, provincial supply obligations, and a professional military bureaucracy. Campaigns were planned years in advance, not months. Vienna appeared on these plans as a logical extension of earlier conquests in the Balkans. Hungary had already been neutralized as an effective buffer. Not fully conquered in 1529, but administratively broken. Fortresses were isolated. Nobility was divided. The Ottomans did not need Hungary to collapse. They only needed it to stop functioning as a coordinated defensive system. That condition was met. For Vienna, the crisis looked different. The city was not designed to absorb a siege of that scale. Its walls were strong, but its hinterland was fragmented. The Holy Roman Empire could not mobilize quickly. Its military authority was distributed across princes with competing priorities. Vienna could not rely on immediate relief. It had to function as a temporary independent system. This explains the focus on preparation rather than confrontation. The city authorities expanded fortifications, not outward patrols. They stockpiled food instead of raising large field armies. The assumption was not that the Ottomans could be defeated in open battle. The assumption was that delay was the only viable strategy. In 1683, the structural problem remained largely the same. The Ottomans again approached Vienna as part of a larger administrative solution: secure Hungary, pressure Habsburg authority, force negotiations from a position of logistical dominance. The army that marched west was not improvised. It followed established supply corridors, supported by provincial levies and specialist corps. Vienna, again, was not the main objective in isolation. It was a lever. If it fell, the political geography of Central Europe would reorganize around Ottoman priorities. If it held, the campaign would drain resources without producing systemic change. The European response in 1683 appeared dramatic only at the final stage. In reality, it was slow and uncertain. Coalition forces assembled with difficulty. Command structures were negotiated as much as planned. The famous relief force existed because Vienna survived long enough for those negotiations to conclude. Both sieges reveal the same underlying problem. Large empires do not fail at walls. They fail when their systems lose synchronization. Vienna survived twice because it forced the Ottoman campaign into a time frame the broader imperial system could not sustain. Not because the attackers lacked power, but because power has limits when distance, weather, and administration stop aligning. At no point was this a simple clash of armies. It was a competition between two ways of organizing space, resources, and time. Only one of them could remain coherent long enough to impose its will. The Ottoman siege system was not improvised in front of Vienna. It arrived already assembled. What mattered most was not the number of soldiers, but how authority, labor, and resources were divided and controlled once the army stopped moving. At the top sat the Sultan, but he did not issue tactical orders. Campaign authority was delegated downward. Through a clear hierarchy, the Grand Vizier functioned as the operational manager. Below him were commanders assigned, not only to combat units, but to logistics, engineering, and security. Each role had defined limits. No single actor controlled the entire process. This prevented paralysis and reduced dependence on individual judgment. The army itself was segmented by function. Janissaries were not general infantry. They were a regulated force with fixed pay, rations, and rotation schedules. Cavalry units were tied to land grants, which obligated them to appear with equipment already funded by the state. Engineers were a separate professional class. Miners, sappers, artillery crews, and bridge builders answered to their own command chain. This mattered during a siege, because violence was only one output of the system. The more important output was pressure. Artillery was deployed to test walls, not to immediately breach them. Shots were fired to measure responses. Where defenders concentrated repairs, Ottoman engineers adjusted mining targets. The siege evolved through feedback loops. Legal structure reinforced this system. Provincial governors were required to supply food, animals, and labor along the campaign route. These were not voluntary contributions. They were audited obligations, recorded before the army moved. Failure to meet quotas resulted in penalties after the campaign. This ensured supply without constant negotiation. Vienna's defenders operated under a different architecture. Authority was concentrated locally because imperial command was distant and slow. City councils, military governors, and guild leaders shared responsibility. Decisions required consensus. This slowed action but increased internal compliance. Once a plan was agreed upon, enforcement was strict. Labor inside Vienna was reorganized by decree. Civilians were assigned to fortification work, supply transport, and firefighting. Movement within the city was regulated. Night curfews reduced disorder. Food distribution was centralized. These were not emergency improvisations. They followed existing municipal procedures, adapted for siege conditions. The underground war exposed the contrast between systems most clearly. Ottoman mining operations followed standardized methods. Tunnels were dug at calculated depths. Timber supports followed known ratios. Explosives were prepared by trained specialists. When a mine failed, responsibility was administrative, not personal. Another team took over. Vienna's countermining relied on local expertise. Guild miners, accustomed to regional geology, were repurposed. Their work was coordinated by military engineers, but executed by civilians. This blurred the line between combatant and non-combatant. Not emotionally, but structurally. The city converted its economic labor base into a defensive instrument. Records mattered. Ottoman clerks tracked ammunition expenditure, labor losses, and food consumption. Vienna did the same. The siege was documented as it happened. These records allowed commanders to adjust expectations. When rain slowed mining, timelines shifted. When disease reduced manpower, tasks were reprioritized. What emerges is not a story of chaos under pressure, but of systems colliding. Both sides relied on administration to transform space into control. Walls were not just stone. They were maintained by paperwork, schedules, and enforced obligations. The Ottoman system was optimized for movement and expansion. It assumed that distance could be managed through layered logistics. Vienna's system was optimized for containment. It assumed that survival depended on shrinking the problem until it could be managed locally. Neither system was irrational. Both were internally coherent. The outcome depended on which structure could remain functional longer under stress. Siege warfare was not a breakdown of order. It was order pushed to its limits, measured day by day, tunnel by tunnel, ledger by ledger. The Ottoman siege of Vienna worked as well as it did, because it minimized the need for decisive battle. Violence was a tool, not the objective. The real objective was control through exhaustion, predictability, and denial of options. The first advantage was scale applied selectively. The Ottoman army was large, but it was not deployed everywhere at once. Forces were concentrated where pressure produced the highest return. Artillery focused on limited wall sectors. Mining targeted specific bastions. Cavalry controlled approaches and cut communication. This prevented the defenders from spreading their effort evenly. Every response Vienna made revealed priorities, and those priorities became targets. Time worked in favor of the besiegers, at least initially. The Ottoman system assumed that defenders would degrade faster than attackers. Supplies behind the walls were finite. Morale was treated as a consumable resource. The goal was not to terrify civilians, but to force administrators to make increasingly restrictive decisions. Rationing, labor conscription, curfews. Each measure reduced flexibility and increased internal strain. Resistance was neutralized early through isolation. Vienna could not sortie effectively because surrounding territory was controlled. Messenger routes were cut or monitored. Relief forces, if they were to arrive, had to assemble slowly and move through contested zones. This delay was not accidental. Ottoman cavalry and auxiliary forces existed largely to enforce this strategic isolation, not to fight pitched battles. Cost efficiency mattered. The Ottoman state did not want to destroy Vienna completely. Ruined cities produced no tax. Artillery bombardment was calibrated to damage walls, not infrastructure behind them. Mining aimed to create breaches, not urban devastation. This restraint was not humanitarian, it was administrative foresight. The system also limited internal dissent. Ottoman troops were paid, rotated, and regulated. Looting before victory was restricted. Discipline was enforced through law, charisma. This reduced chaos within the besieging army and prevented the kind of breakdowns that plagued many early modern campaigns. Vienna's defense worked for opposite reasons. It did not try to match Ottoman strength. It focused on denial. The city accepted that it could not project power outward. Instead, it absorbed pressure inward. Walls were repaired immediately after damage. Breaches were filled overnight. Fires were contained before spreading. Every Ottoman success was treated as temporary unless it could be exploited immediately. Psychological pressure was managed structurally. Authorities controlled information. News of defeats outside the city was filtered. Public rituals were maintained to preserve routine. This was not optimism. It was containment of panic, which administrators understood as a destabilizing variable. The underground war shows why both systems functioned, as long as they did. Mines rarely achieved immediate collapse. Countermines rarely eliminated the threat entirely. What mattered was tempo. Each side tried to force the other into reactive mode. The Ottomans sought to dictate, where defenders had to commit labor. Vienna sought to slow operations until weather, disease, and distance degraded the attackers. In 1683, the same logic applied, but with an added complication. The Ottoman system was stretched further from its core. Supply lines were longer. Command coordination faced delays. The besieging army remained powerful, but its margin for error was thinner. When relief forces finally arrived, they did not defeat the Ottomans because they were tactically superior. They disrupted timing. The siege failed not at the walls, but in synchronization. Ottoman forces had not completed the administrative destruction of Vienna before external pressure arrived. Once forced into open battle, at an unfavorable moment, the advantages of siege warfare disappeared. What this reveals is uncomfortable. Systems of power succeed, not through overwhelming violence, but through sustained control that appears almost routine. Vienna survived because it endured long enough for the Ottoman system to lose efficiency. Had the timeline shifted slightly, the outcome would have been different. Sieges reward patience, discipline, and logistics more than courage. They succeed when resistance collapses quietly, through shortages, miscalculations, and administrative fatigue. Vienna was not saved by a single charge or a single commander. It was saved because the system designed to break it could not remain optimized indefinitely. That is why the sieges matter. They show how effective power operates until its margins vanish, and they show how survival in such conditions depends less on strength than on forcing an enemy system to exceed its own limits. The human cost of the sieges did not appear as mass death in a single moment. It accumulated quietly through structural conversion of people into expendable functions. Inside Vienna, civilians stopped being civilians early. They became labor units assigned to walls, trenches, and supply chains. Their value was measured in hours worked and calories consumed. When food ran low, the system did not ask who deserved to eat. It recalculated rations. Disease followed structure, not chaos. Overcrowding behind the walls increased transmission. Waste disposal systems were overloaded by design, not neglect. Quarantine was enforced selectively, because total isolation would have halted essential labor. The result was predictable. Mortality rose among those whose work could not be suspended, especially miners, haulers, and repair crews. These deaths were recorded, but not individually mourned. They were absorbed into totals. Children disappeared from records first, not because they were spared, but because they did not fit cleanly into administrative categories. Orphans were reassigned to households or religious institutions without documentation. Their future labor potential mattered more than their past losses. This was not cruelty. It was continuity management. For the besiegers, the cost followed a different logic. Ottoman losses were distributed across a much larger population base, which made them easier to absorb statistically. Soldiers who died of disease or exposure were replaced through existing recruitment mechanisms. Provincial obligations ensured new arrivals. This masked the long-term strain on rural communities supplying men, animals, and food. Mining casualties were particularly revealing. Tunnel collapses, misfires, and countermines killed specialists whose training took years. Each loss reduced operational efficiency, yet these men were recorded as numbers against quotas. The system accounted for replacement time, not for expertise lost. Over successive campaigns, this erosion mattered. Outside Vienna, the surrounding countryside paid a cost that rarely appears in siege narratives. Fields went untended. Livestock was requisitioned or scattered. Local economies collapsed temporarily, sometimes permanently. These areas did not benefit from the city's survival. They were stripped to sustain both attacker and defender, then left depleted. In 1683, the scale increased. Coalition warfare multiplied administrative friction. Supply demands from multiple armies overlapped. Civilians along relief routes faced forced requisitions justified by emergency. Once the siege ended, these losses were not reversed. Tax records adjusted, debts carried forward. Population gaps remained. What makes these costs irreversible is not their size, but their distribution. No single community could claim recognition. Losses were spread thinly enough to avoid immediate collapse, but widely enough to prevent recovery to previous conditions. The siege ended. The damage persisted. The systems involved were not blind to this. They accepted it. Early modern states treated population as a renewable resource within limits. As long as those limits were not crossed visibly, harm remained normalized. Vienna survived, but it emerged altered. its demographics shifted, its labor structures hardened. Emergency measures became precedents. The uncomfortable reality is that both sides succeeded by treating people as inputs. Survival required compliance with this logic. Resistance that did not fit the system's categories was ignored or removed. The siege did not end suffering. It reorganized it into forms that could be managed. This is the true cost of endurance-based warfare. It does not annihilate societies. It reshapes them permanently, quietly, and without clear moments of accountability. The sieges of Vienna leave an unresolved problem that sits beneath the military narrative. Both sides behaved rationally within their systems. Both optimized for stability, control, and acceptable loss. Yet the outcome hinged on factors neither system could fully command. The Ottoman model assumed that superior organization could overcome distance. It was built on the belief that logistics, discipline, and time would neutralize resistance without requiring catastrophic violence. For decades, this assumption had proven correct. Vienna challenged it, not by defeating the system, but by forcing it to operate at the edge of its tolerances. Weather, disease, delayed coordination, and external coalitions introduced friction that no amount of planning could fully eliminate. Vienna's survival, however, does not represent a moral victory of defense over aggression. The city endured by adopting similar logic. It centralized authority, it restricted movement, it reduced individuals to functions. The measures that saved the city also hardened its governance. Emergency powers did not vanish when the siege ended. They became templates. The relief of 1683 is often framed as a decisive turning point. Strategically, it was not. It did not dismantle the Ottoman system. It interrupted a campaign. The empire continued to function, to tax, to recruit, and to fight elsewhere. Likewise, Europe did not suddenly unify. The coalition dissolved once the immediate pressure lifted. Coordination remained situational, not structural. What remains uncomfortable is this: effective systems do not fail because they are unjust or cruel. They fail when complexity exceeds control. Vienna survived twice because it created conditions where the Ottoman system could no longer operate efficiently at that distance. Not because the system was wrong, but because it reached its operational boundary. This raises a question without a clean answer. If success depends on pushing systems to their limits, then endurance becomes indistinguishable from complicity. Vienna survived by accepting costs imposed on its population and its hinterland. The Ottomans withdrew because continued investment no longer promised return. In both cases, people absorbed the difference. The sieges show that history does not turn on moments of clarity. It turns on margins, on days of delay, on supplies arriving late, on decisions made to preserve order rather than lives. Power operates quietly until it cannot. Vienna stands not as a symbol of triumph, but as evidence of how close control systems can come to total effectiveness, and how narrow the space is between survival and absorption. The question left behind is not why Vienna was attacked or why it held. It is how many other places failed the same test without ever being remembered.